The story begins with a silence. A silence so complete, you could mistake it for peace, until you realize what it's covering. They say the hills of West Virginia keep their dead well, that the clay there drinks secrets as greedily as it drinks rain. But every so often, one rises back up, in the form of a story so old it shouldn't have survived, and yet, it does. In the spring of 1868, a census taker from Charleston rode out to the remote slopes of Fayette County. His records, later filed among hundreds of others, seemed ordinary at first glance. But in the faded ink of one household, there was something that no one could quite explain. The head of the family was listed as Elias K, a farmer, age 42. His wife, Margaret K, age 39. Nothing unusual. Except in the margin, where the census taker had added 3 small words in uncertain handwriting. Also listed as sister. That note would go unnoticed for over a century. The census page yellowed, folded, forgotten in a courthouse basement. But when it was rediscovered in the 1970s by a local historian, it would become the seed of one of the strangest family histories ever uncovered in Appalachia. Elias K. was born in 1826, to a German immigrant father and a mother of Scots-Irish descent. The family owned a small stretch of land on the edge of the New River Gorge, a place so wild it was almost unreachable before the railroad came. People there were born, lived, and died without ever stepping into a proper town. The K family was no different. By the time Elias was 20, his father had gone to war, first against Mexico, then never returned. His mother died the following winter. That left Elias, the eldest, to care for his 3 younger siblings, Ruth, Margaret, and Samuel. Neighbors remembered him as a man of order, someone who didn't speak much but carried an aura of unbending control. One former neighbor described him, years later, as a man whose eyes were too still, like the pond behind their house after the dog drowned. What happened in that house after the parents' deaths is mostly speculation. Records vanish, letters are missing. But we know this, by 1860, only Elias and Margaret remained. The others were gone, Samuel to the mines, Ruth to a fever that swept through the hollow. When the Civil War came, Elias didn't enlist. He stayed behind, tending a small farm with his companion, as one local newspaper would later call her. That word, companion, was a polite way of saying what no one dared to say outright. Because by the time peace returned, Elias and Margaret were living as husband and wife. No church record exists of a marriage. No certificate, no witnesses. But their neighbors knew. You can almost hear it in the way they described them in later depositions, too carefully, too cautiously. They kept to themselves. She was devoted. He was a serious man, private-like. Every phrase, a boundary line drawn around something no one wanted to touch. And yet, even through the hush of history, something darker seeps through. In one surviving letter from a neighboring family, written in 1871, a woman named Eliza G. warns her sister never to visit the K. property. He keeps her like she were chained to the place, she wrote. No laughter, no sound but the hens and his boots. By then, Margaret had already borne 2 children, both stillborn, if Elias's own notes are to be believed. But there are no graves for them. No baptismal records. Only the census, one empty column for children surviving. And here is where the story turns from unsettling to something else entirely. Because in 1873, Margaret disappeared. Elias told the local magistrate that she had gone to stay with distant kin in Greenbrier County. That was enough, for a while. But when months passed, and then years, and no one saw her again, rumors began to take root. Some said she'd run off, unable to bear the shame. Others whispered she'd died in childbirth and that Elias had buried her in the orchard. When they finally searched the property in 1878, they found nothing. No grave. No bones. Only a patch of ground near the springhouse that looked, according to the report, recently disturbed. But no body was ever produced. And so the record ends there, with Elias K. living alone until his death in 1891. His headstone still stands today in a small Methodist plot, the lettering faint but legible. It reads, E.K., beloved husband. No mention of Margaret. No mention of sister. What's most haunting isn't what's recorded, it's what isn't. The absence is almost deliberate, like a wound hidden beneath clean linen. And when you study those old courthouse papers, the census, the land deeds, the marriage records, you begin to sense a pattern in the omissions. The K name appears in local archives for decades after Elias's death, though always under slight variations. Con. Cain. Cain. It's as though the family kept shifting shape, retreating from what they once were. And perhaps that's the real curse, not the sin itself, but the silence that grows around it, swallowing every generation that tries to speak. If you visit Fayette County today, you can still find the ruins of their farm, stone foundations beneath a tangle of sumac and vine. Locals call it the house with two names. Some say on quiet nights, you can hear a woman's voice from the orchard, calling out just once, like someone counting children who never answered back. No one's ever proved any of it. But then again, maybe proof was never the point. Some stories aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be carried, like guilt that outlives the guilty. And in the case of Elias K., that burden still lingers in the soil of West Virginia, where brother and sister once called themselves husband and wife, and no one dared to stop them. In the years that followed Elias's death, the land changed hands again and again, as though no one could keep it for long. Some said the soil was cursed, others claimed the place simply drove people mad. But in every deed, every faded record, there's a faint echo of his name, never written in full, always abbreviated, always wary, as if even the paper itself was afraid of remembering. It wasn't until 1924 that the K family came back into local memory, when a boy named Henry Kane was arrested in nearby Montgomery for assaulting his own cousin. During questioning, the sheriff's report notes something strange. When asked about his parents, Henry grew quiet, then said, "We don't talk about that side." That phrase, "that side," would become a recurring whisper in the family for generations. By the 1940s, a few descendants had moved north to Ohio and Michigan, working in coal and steel. But those who stayed in West Virginia carried the story like a shadow. An old family Bible, found in the attic of a relative's home in 1953, bore two names crossed out so violently the paper tore through, Elias and Margaret. Beneath them, someone had written in pencil, "What God saw, no man can unsee." You begin to realize, studying the records, that this was never a simple act of forbidden love. It was control. Possession. And maybe something older, something buried deep in the way that isolation feeds sickness. Because West Virginia in the 1800s was a land of silence. Families lived miles apart, cut off by mountains and rivers. Generations married within the same few hollows, the same bloodlines folding over themselves like paper creased too many times. And in that silence, something began to twist. People like Elias didn't think of themselves as monsters. They thought of themselves as custodians, keepers of a name, a land, a bloodline. And sometimes, when a person believes he's the last guardian of his family's honor, he'll do anything to keep it from dying out. Anything. There's an 1889 letter preserved in the state archives, unsigned, but found among Fayette County correspondence. The handwriting matches Elias's known samples. It reads, "Her blood is mine. The Lord will forgive, for he made us of one flesh before ever we sinned. I take not from the world, only from my own." It's hard to read that line without feeling a kind of nausea. That warped theology, the twisting of scripture into justification, is something you see again and again in the darker corners of American history. The justifications of men who couldn't see where righteousness ended and desire began. And maybe that's what this story really reveals. Not just the act itself, but the quiet, methodical erasure that followed it. When the historian who rediscovered the census note first published his findings in a local genealogical journal, he received more letters than he expected, most anonymous, many angry. One in particular, written in careful cursive, simply said, "Let the dead lie." He did what he had to do. Whoever wrote that believed they were defending a legacy. But legacies built on silence rot from within. You can trace the pattern through the generations. Depression. Violence. Children who vanished from records without explanation. In 1912, a woman named Annie Kane, believed to be Elias's great-granddaughter, was institutionalized at Weston State Hospital after refusing to speak for nearly 2 years. Her intake report lists one chilling phrase under diagnosis. Claims to be the child of her uncle. There's no way to prove any blood connection to Elias. But the geography lines up. The family name, the isolation, the same small county roads winding back into themselves like a noose. It's as if the story kept echoing down the generations, wearing new faces but the same shape. And it makes you wonder, what happens when a family spends a century pretending something never happened? Sometimes silence isn't the absence of sound. It's a presence, heavy and watchful. It changes the way children are raised, the way fathers speak, or don't. The way certain rooms are never entered after dark. A local man who grew up near the old K. property once told a folklorist in the 1970s that his grandmother forbade them from walking past the orchard after sundown. Not because of ghosts, he said. Because of memory. And in those words lies something deeper than superstition. Memory itself becomes the haunting. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you dig into it, or would you bury it deeper? Because the truth is, every family has its silences. Some are small, personal, forgettable. But others are vast enough to swallow generations whole. And when you start peeling back those layers, you find that what's buried isn't just a story, it's a system. A pattern. The patriarch who claimed his sister as wife wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. In those post-war years, Appalachia was full of men who'd returned from the battlefield broken, spiritually, mentally, sometimes literally. The world had moved on without them. Their farms gone to ruin, their families scattered. And in that ruin, some of them built their own worlds, small, cruel kingdoms where their word was law and blood was both sacred and expendable. Elias wasn't the first. He wasn't even the last. But his story survived, barely, because of one nervous census taker who didn't quite know what he was looking at, and wrote down just enough to damn them both. Sometimes history isn't recorded by the powerful. Sometimes it's recorded by a trembling hand in the margin, trying to make sense of something that shouldn't exist. And in those margins, we find the real America. The one that hides beneath the surface, where faith and madness intertwine, where love and ownership become indistinguishable, and where the past never really dies. It just waits. When the historian's article resurfaced in the early 2000s, digitized, searchable, and stripped of dust, the story of Elias and Margaret spread beyond local lore. It found new readers. Genealogists, amateur historians, and eventually those who claimed to be descendants. And with them came a question that no one had ever answered. What really happened to Margaret? There are two competing theories. The first says she fled, that she took what little she could carry and disappeared into the wilderness, maybe even made it as far as Kanawha County or beyond. The second says she never left the property. There's a private letter written by a surveyor in 1904, during a property dispute involving land that once belonged to Elias. He described finding, quote, a small stone enclosure near the spring, shaped like a cradle, with no markings save for a single carved M. The letter was filed away, never followed up on. The enclosure was later destroyed during a flood in 1911. But there are photographs, grainy, underexposed, showing a small mound surrounded by wildflowers. No context, no date. Only the caption, Elias's place. It's the silence around that image that speaks the loudest. By the time the 20th century rolled through, the Kane family name had scattered like pollen, Ohio, Kentucky, Pennsylvania. The paper trail thins, then disappears. But what doesn't disappear are the echoes. Every few decades, someone finds something, an heirloom, a journal, a photograph, and the old questions return. In 1986, a woman from Charleston named Mary Kane contacted the West Virginia Historical Society. She said her grandmother used to wake in the night screaming a single name, Maggie. When she asked who Maggie was, her grandmother said, "She's the one who wasn't allowed to die right." That phrase, "wasn't allowed to die right," is part of old Appalachian superstition. It refers to those who die without dignity, without witness, or without proper burial. The belief is that such souls linger, not to haunt, but to remind. So maybe the story of Elias and Margaret isn't about incest or madness, not at its core. Maybe it's about the refusal to let go. A brother who couldn't accept loss. A sister who couldn't escape ownership. A family who couldn't bear the weight of knowing, and so passed that silence like an heirloom. It's easy to dismiss stories like this as rural folklore, the byproduct of isolation and rumor. But the records exist. The census taker's handwriting. The courthouse margins. The testimonies of neighbors who never saw her again. They're there, like fingerprints pressed into history, refusing to fade. And maybe the most chilling part is that Elias wasn't remembered as a villain. His obituary, published in 1891 in the Fayette Register, describes him as a man of faith and perseverance. It praises his devotion to family and calls him a pillar of his community. A pillar. That's what we do, isn't it? We polish our monsters until they shine. We rename them founders and patriarchs. We tell ourselves they built this country, forgetting what, and who, they built it on. When you start looking, you see it everywhere. The families who stayed too long in one valley, marrying within the same few surnames. The faded portraits of unsmiling men whose descendants refused to speak their names. The bloodlines that vanish not because they died out, but because someone finally chose to change the spelling, to hide. Elias's legacy isn't a single sin, it's a map of silence. A demonstration of how entire communities can conspire to forget. And yet, the land remembers. Locals say when the river rises in spring, it turns the soil near the old farmyard a deeper red than anywhere else. They call it the bleeding ground. Maybe it's iron, or clay, or maybe it's just the imagination of those who've heard the story too many times. But there's a quiet belief that the land is trying to tell something. A warning, perhaps. That when love becomes possession, it stops being human. That when a name becomes more sacred than the truth, it poisons every generation that bears it. Because there's something profoundly American about Elias K. Not the act itself, but the aftermath. The silence. The rewriting. The way the story was absorbed into myth and memory until it became just another ghost among the hills. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that he claimed his sister as wife, but that we almost lost the proof he ever did. That the only reason we know his name now is because a stranger, 100 years later, cared enough to look. It makes you wonder, how many others were buried in the same way? How many names erased by time, not by accident, but by choice? There's a certain kind of horror that doesn't scream. It whispers. It sits in archives, in yellowed paper and fading ink. It lives in the pauses between records, the omissions that form a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And if you listen long enough, to the river, to the soil, to the silence of history, you begin to hear the same refrain, we are still here. You just stopped looking. So when you walk the old roads of Fayette County, and you see the stones half swallowed by moss, remember this: not every grave is marked, and not every story stays buried. Some, like Elias and Margaret's, cling to the earth itself, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to uncover them again. And when you do, don't expect closure. Expect questions. Expect echoes. Expect the uncomfortable realization that what happened in those hills was not an anomaly, but a reflection. Because the story of one man who called his sister, wife, isn't just a tragedy of a family long gone. It's a mirror, held up to the American past, a reminder that beneath the myth of frontier virtue, there are things too dark to forget, and too true to deny. And if you've listened this far, then maybe, just maybe, the hills have decided you were meant to know. The past doesn't die. It waits.